Well, thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program entitled The Fascinating Life and Legacy of Massachusetts Dinosaur Pioneer Edward Hitchcock. And so author Robert T. McMaster will discuss his latest book, All the Light Here Comes From Above, The Life and Legacy of Edward Hitchcock, in this Zoom webinar. So Robert T. McMaster's interest in Edward Hitchcock began when he visited the Pratt Museum of Natural History at Amherst College over a half-century ago. After completing his undergraduate studies at Clark University, he attended graduate school at Andover Newton Theological School and Boston College, earning a master's degree in geology and education at BC. Robert taught middle school science and worked as an administrator for several environmental education organizations over the next 15 years. Returning to graduate school in 1990, he earned an MA in biological sciences at Smith College and a PhD in plant biology at the University of Massachusetts. Robert then taught biology at Holyoke Community College from 1994 to 2014, and he has authored many articles on botany, conservation biology, and the history of science. And he's also written 3 historical novels set in New England in the World War I era. And I'm going to give you 3 sentences about the book. So Edward Hitchcock, who was born in 1793 and died in 1864, was a geological pioneer, a native of Deerfield, Massachusetts. He was the first state geologist of Massachusetts, the first American geologist to publicly embrace the theory of continental glaciation, and the first scientist to unearth evidence of dinosaurs in North America. And Robert's book, All the Light Here Comes From Above, is the first biography ever written of Hitchcock, which was one of the 19th century America's most influential scientists. So all 50 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Robert for joining us here tonight. And Robert, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert, and everybody in the Tewksbury Public Library and all those cooperating libraries. And of course, thank you to all of you out there for joining us this evening. The Bay State has long been home to many of the world's most eminent scientists. And that is true today, and it was certainly true even 200 years ago. This woman, Maria Mitchell, for example, from Nantucket, was a pioneer in astronomy. Louis Agassiz was a renowned paleontologist from Cambridge, although he was a native of Switzerland. He lived most of his adult life in Cambridge and at Harvard. Henry David Thoreau, of course, of Concord, would not approve of being the labeled scientist, I'm sure, but certainly he was an astute observer of the natural world. And then there is this man, Edward Hitchcock, poet, playwright, preacher, philosopher, paleontologist, professor, and 3rd president of Amherst College. He was, without a doubt, one of the most influential scientists in 19th century America, both here in America, in North America, and in Europe. While the lives of those other 3 folks there have been well documented in biographies, I was surprised to learn a few years ago that no biography had ever been written for Edward Hitchcock. And so in 2017, I began my research. And last year, as Robert mentioned, my book was finally in print. And tonight, I'll trace for you a timeline of Edward Hitchcock's life, and then focus in on the 4 major areas of his importance and his legacy: geology, paleontology, religion, and higher education. And I'll be delighted to get some questions from you at the end. As Robert mentioned, Edward was born in Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1793, in this house, which still stands on the campus of Deerfield Academy. He and his siblings all attended Deerfield. It had just opened in 1799. Edward attended Deerfield for parts of 6 years, from 1804 to 1809. And believe it or not, those 6 years, or portions of 6 years, was the full extent of Edward Hitchcock's formal education. Not surprisingly, he excelled at science and math, but in 1809, at the age of 16, he left the academy, and for the next few years, he was tutored by this man, his uncle, Epiphras Hoyt, a scholar and an author with a particular interest in astronomy. And so young Edward and Uncle Ep, as he was known, devoted much of their time to the study of astronomy. And it seemed the stars were aligned for Edward and Uncle Ep, because in 1811, two extraordinary astronomical events occurred. First, the solar eclipse of 1811, which was spectacular. And secondly, the comet of 1811, which was notable because it was visible for 9 months, which was a record for a comet's visibility right up until 1990s when Hale-Bopp exceeded it. And every night, and sometimes all night long, Edward would be out there charting the path of that comet to the point where he made himself ill. And when the family doctor came to see him, he said, "I see what your difficulty is. You have got the comet's tail in your stomach." Well, having a comet's tail in his stomach would be the story of the rest of Edward Hitchcock's life, as we'll see. Now, while Edward and Uncle Ep were doing their astronomical studies, they made frequent use of this volume, the Nautical Almanac, edited by Edmund Blunt. It was a very, very important resource to astronomers, but also to navigators at sea. And Edmund Blunt, you might guess from that image, was a very proud, self-assured man, so much so that he promised in several places in every edition of his almanac to pay $10 to anyone who would find an error. Well, guess what? Edward Hitchcock found errors, lots of errors. He wrote a series of personal letters to Edmund Blunt in which he accounted for some more than 100 errors in the Nautical Almanac. And Edward Hitchcock felt that these were critically important, especially to navigators at sea. Well, Edmund Blunt stonewalled Edward for a good deal of time until Edward went public and published three letters in the American Monthly magazine published in Boston. And when Edmund Blunt started to pay attention. And eventually Blunt grudgingly admitted that mistakes have been made. Where have we heard that phrase, huh? But if you think Edward Hitchcock ever got any of those $10 rewards for his efforts, he got nothing, nada. Except that in 1818, Yale College honored Edward Hitchcock with an honorary degree of Masters of Arts, the first of 3 honorary degrees that he would receive in his lifetime. So Edward Hitchcock got paid in one form that was very important to him. And furthermore, he was now a household word across the nation as the David who slew Goliath, so to speak. Well, in 1816, Edward returned to Deerfield Academy now as headmaster or preceptor, the teacher of the male students. He worked there with this young woman who had been there already several years, Ora White of Amherst, a very well-educated young woman, and she was the preceptress, the teacher of the female students. Deerfield Academy was a very, very progressive institution, but that is, they allowed women to be admitted, but not in the same room and not at the same time, God forbid. So Edward was the teacher of the male students, Ora of the female students. You can still go into that building, which is part of the historic Deerfield and the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association in Deerfield, and you can sit in one of those benches in their lecture rooms there and imagine what that world must have been like. Now, Ora White was also a very devout fundamentalist Christian. They called themselves Orthodox Christians at the time, and she succeeded in converting Edward to Calvinism. And that would be his faith for the rest of his life, and it would become very, very important, as I think you'll see, in his career. While Edward was at Deerfield Academy, he published his first scientific paper, Remarks on the Geology and Mineralogy of a Section of Massachusetts on Connecticut River with a part of New Hampshire and Vermont. He published it in a new journal called the American Journal of Science and Arts, which was produced at Yale in New Haven. It would be the first of some 120 scientific papers that Edward would publish in scholarly journals over the course of his career. Well, Edward was dismissed from Deerfield Academy after just 2 years, not, I believe, for any shortcomings on his part. He was very well liked, but because the Academy was in dire financial straits. And in fact, they closed their doors just a few months after his dismissal. Well, Edward had some time on his hands then. And in the spring of 1819, he traveled to New Haven. And he sat in on classes by these two men, Benjamin Silliman, a world-renowned geologist and chemist, and Eleazar Fitch, a very, very prominent theologian of his day. Not as an enrolled student, but we might call him an auditor or an unmatriculated student today, with the permission of those two professors. Now, Yale College was a fundamentalist Christian or Orthodox Christian institution at that time. How could it not be? Timothy Dwight, the president, was the grandson of Jonathan Edwards of Northampton, that probably a familiar name to some of you, that revivalist preacher. And so Yale had a distinctly Orthodox religious tradition. And that put him at odds with Harvard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which had a Unitarian orientation. And the two battled it out. For those of you around Andover, perhaps you know that Andover Seminary was formed about that time, 1804, as an Orthodox institution meant to counterbalance the influence of Harvard Unitarians in Massachusetts. Well, at the end of 7 weeks, Professor Fitch arranged for Edward to preach a sermon at the Congregational Church in West Haven. It was his first sermon. And after preaching it, he wrote, "Felt much solicitude, diffidence, and weakness in this first effort in the pulpit, but have much reason to be grateful that utterance was given me." Well, a lack of utterance would never be a problem for Edward Hitchcock. This was the first of over 1,000 sermons that he would deliver in his career. Edward came back to Deerfield with a new voice and a new vocation. He was now Edward Hitchcock, itinerant preacher, and he traveled around Western Massachusetts. There he is in his horse and buggy, substituting for preachers on Sundays, up and down the Connecticut Valley, sometimes into Connecticut and up into Vermont, and on a few occasions in Eastern Massachusetts as well. His services were very much in demand. As you can see, those numbers represent how many times he preached in Deerfield or in Springfield or in Brattleboro, Vermont. But he preached 30 times in Conway, Massachusetts, in the foothills of the Berkshires. Why so many times in Conway? Well, the minister of the Conway Church was John Emerson, great uncle, by the way, of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And John was getting along in years and was in poor health. And so that's why Edward was called upon so frequently to substitute. And so, not surprisingly, when Reverend Emerson announced his partial retirement in May of 1821, Edward received the call. Within days after that event, Edward and Ora were married in a tavern in Amherst. Now, there's a mystery I still have to solve, is why would these two devout folks be married in a tavern? But anyway, and very soon they moved to Conway and set up housekeeping Edward was ordained, and in late June of 1821, he preached in his first Sunday in his new church. They would remain in Conway for 4 years. At the end of their first year, Ora gave birth to a little boy whom they named Edward. And life was grand for a time. Edward Hitchcock was not in the practice of introducing personal matters into sermons, not by any means. But in March of 1824, he stunned his congregation in the middle of a sermon on the sovereignty of God when he said as follows: "Thus far I had preceded my hearers in the composition of this discourse, when I was called away to witness in the prostrated agonies and final removal of an only child, a painful exhibition of the sovereign dominion of Jehovah." Tragedy had struck the Hitchcock family, and their little boy, less than just short of 2 years, died of consumption. Needless to say, the couple were devastated. But these words below here, I think, are extremely revealing about Edward and Ora. He said later in the same sermon, "If there is one feeling within us that is stronger than the rest, it is a sense that we deserve that punishment, the death of their child. And it lends smarting poignancy to the wound to know that the arrow which has pierced us passed first through the heart of our child." It's hard to imagine a heavier burden laid upon grieving parents than that of the belief that they lost their child because of their own sins. But that was the nature of the Hitchcock's faith. About a year and a half later, Edward resigned his pastorate in Conway. The ostensible reason was poor health. But I think there are 3 other likely factors that contributed to this decision. One, of course, was the death of little Edward, which probably made continuing to live in Conway painful to the couple. Another was that Edward's loyalties were divided, very much divided. During the 4 years that he preached in Conway, he published no fewer than 20 papers, scientific papers. So he clearly was torn as far as his interests were concerned. And the third factor that no doubt played a role here was that he was offered a professorship at Amherst College. Now, Amherst had been founded only 4 years earlier, and it was founded as an institution for the education of young men for the preparing for the Christian ministry. That was the founding charter, mission of the college. And Edward, no doubt, thought, well, this is perfect. I can pursue my ministerial work, my preaching, but also my science. And so Edward Hitchcock was a faculty member at Amherst College for 37 years, for the rest of his life. He taught chemistry, mineralogy, geology, natural history, botany, and Bible studies. He taught geology every single year from 1826 to 1863, even the years when he was president. It was his first love, for sure, academically. In 1829, Edward began keeping what he called his private notes. Now, this wasn't exactly a diary. It wasn't anywhere close to every day, but it was periodic notes on his career and on his life. And as you read this, you see a pattern here. Almost every entry makes mention of his health, and many of them predict his imminent death. In 1833, for instance, he wrote, "If his providence does not save me, I shall soon be in my grave." In 1834, "Perhaps my present state of health is only a short respite from the grave." In 1847, while he was president of Amherst College, he wrote, "The college will rise and flourish, but I must die soon." And in 1859, he wrote, "The probability is faint of my seeing another year, and I long to be prepared to go. Clearly, Edward Hitchcock was consumed, one might even say obsessed, with his own death. And you might think that such a fixation on one's impending doom would have a depressing effect, making it difficult to get out of bed each day, to carry on in life. But with Edward Hitchcock, the very opposite was true. It seems he used this belief in his impending death as an incentive to get busy, to teach, to preach, to publish, to complete the work that God had set out for him. Far from depressing him, his desponding nature, as he referred to it, actually served as a powerful motivator to get on with life, to complete projects, even at times to take on vast new projects. And in 1831, such a vast new project became his. In May of that year, in 1830, I should say, in May of that year, he wrote a letter to then Governor Levi Lincoln, suggesting the idea of a geological survey of Massachusetts. Lincoln approved it, passed it on to the legislature, and within 30 days, Edward Hitchcock was appointed state geologist and tasked with completing an extensive survey of the geology of Massachusetts. And so in the next, that year alone, as you can see from that dot that just flew around the board, the screen there, he spent 56 days in the field, covered 1,600 miles, all in a horse-drawn wagon, visiting 158 towns. He continued this for the next 3 field seasons, for a total of 135 days over those 4 years. He traveled 3,000 miles, visited 266 cities and towns, recorded over 400 pages of notes, and collected several thousand rock and mineral specimens. Everywhere he traveled, he recorded his thoughts and observations on the rocks, minerals, and geological formations he observed. He was much affected by the landscape of Cape Ann, as shown in this woodcut, probably done by Ora from his final report. Far and near, he wrote, we have an image of the pristine earth, the planet in all its nakedness. And I can only guess that maybe that was an illustration from the Dogtown Common area of Gloucester. He was also impressed by the granite in the eastern Massachusetts. Chelmsford granite, he wrote, is very superior. The pillars of the United States Bank and Market House of Boston were obtained from Chelmsford. He wrote that the beautiful granite in Dedham used for the columns of at the front of the courthouse, that would be the Norfolk County Courthouse, I think, is from the southern extremity of Dover and Medfield. He often wrote of bog iron, and he mentioned bog iron as occurring in the northern part of Groton. And similarly, peat, that peat was in abundance in Lexington, Billerica, Bedford, Waltham, Watertown, and many other localities. Edward Hitchcock had a sense of humor. And you can see that in this quote that he has here after visiting Purgatory Chasm in Sutton, near Worcester. He wrote, I met with a rattlesnake among these rocks, but as he kindly warned me that I was invading his dominions, I suffered him to retire into his den, and he suffered me to leave his precincts in peace, mutually willing to be rid of one another's company. One of the goals of Hitchcock's survey was to draw up a detailed geological map of the state, and that he did in his 1833 report. And there it is. It was the first most detailed map, geological map of any state. And it holds up very well compared to modern maps of the bedrock of Massachusetts, keeping in mind that the technology available to Professor Hitchcock was limited to this, what you see here, a geologist's hammer. Another goal of the project was economic. You can imagine the legislature was very interested in having him identify new mineral resources that could be of great economic value to the state. On balance, I'd have to say, I don't think this was a real valuable part of his work. For one thing, Several of the resources that he devoted the most time to, limestone in the west and granite in the east, were already being extensively worked in Massachusetts. So Hitchcock's survey couldn't take any credit for that resource. And by the way, if you're wondering, those were the two biggest mineral resources in Massachusetts in 1830. What's the biggest mineral resource in Massachusetts today? It's trap rock. Interesting little factoid. Edward also was convinced that coal would be an extremely important mineral resource for Massachusetts. He wrote in 1833, the anthracite of Rhode Island and even that of Worcester will be considered by posterity, if not by the present generation, as a treasure of great value. Well, I think it's safe to say that nobody ever made a dollar mining coal in Massachusetts or Rhode Island. There were efforts. There is coal in the Blackstone River Valley and in adjacent Rhode Island, and there were some efforts, but the quality of the coal was inferior, and it could not begin to compete with coal resources elsewhere. You know, we can't exactly fault Edward Hitchcock if he didn't know or could not foresee the much better quality coal that would be discovered in other parts of the country. Similarly, he predicted that gold might be found in Western Massachusetts after finding some in a particular rock type in Somerset, Vermont. So on balance, I'd say the economic component of his work wasn't probably extremely valuable. But there were several very, very important benefits to his survey. One is that his geological surveys, and there were several of them, became models that some 16 or 17 other states emulated within 6 years of Hitchcock's survey. Isn't that interesting? That other states saw this going on and approved it and adopted similar strategies for the survey, and the reports oftentimes were modeled on Hitchcock's, which were voluminous and extremely, extremely detailed. And this man, George Perkins Merrill, wrote some years later that Hitchcock's report on his geological surveys marked an epoch in American geological work. Perhaps even more important than that is the scientific benefits from Hitchcock's surveys. And I'll stick to one of those, which is has to do with the evidence for the Great Flood. Now, Edward Hitchcock, like most scientists of his day, subscribed to the biblical tale of Noah's flood from the book of Genesis, that much of the Earth's surface had been sculpted by the waters of a single great flood. So Edward Hitchcock, up to this time, bought into that idea. But as he traveled around the state of Massachusetts and elsewhere in New England, his faith in that notion would be shaken by two phenomena in particular. One was what he called diluvial grooves, suggesting they were formed by floodwaters, like this in Billerica, all trending from northwest to southeast. He saw this again and again across the state and around New England. And the other was huge boulders and trains of boulders, like this immense boulder that he found and named in Whitingham, Vermont. That's just over the state line. And he named it the Green Mountain Giant, believing it to be the largest boulder in Vermont. And it is very, very big. I can personally attest to that because I stood right in front of it and took my own picture there a few years ago. It is awesome to behold. Well, what astounded Hitchcock and was very curious was that many of these boulders formed trains, long, relatively straight lines, all oriented, again, from northwest to southeast. This one in Western Mass having its origin just over the line in New York State, but including hundreds or even thousands of boulders of varying sizes over a 15-mile path, all from that same source. And Edward Hitchcock began to doubt the Great Flood explanation. He wrote in that report, making every allowance for the reduction of the gravity of these boulders when in water, I confess I cannot conceive how such a work could have been effected by this agency. So he was already having doubts in 1833. Well, a few years later, this man, Louis Agassiz, published his landmark work on continental glaciation. And Edward Hitchcock was probably the first American scientist to embrace Agassiz's theory. It was like a revelation to Hitchcock because it explained so much of what he had been so mystified by for so many years. Well, in 1835, this man, Dr. James Dean of Greenfield, Massachusetts, wrote Edward Hitchcock a very famous letter in which he described a couple of slabs of red sandstone that he had seen in Greenfield. They'd been quarried taken from a quarry in Turner's Falls. And they displayed what looked like animal tracks. And Dean expressed the opinion that they might be turkey tracks, for example. Well, Edward Hitchcock was immediately interested, traveled to Greenfield one day and examined them and told Dr. Dean that he agreed with him, that they were indeed the tracks of animals and likely the tracks of birds on three accounts. First, they were three-toed, like most birds. If there was a fourth toe, it was not always represented in the track because a fourth toe was often elevated. They were digitigrade, meaning they walked on their toes rather than on the soles of their feet like we do. And they were bipedal, that is, they walked on just 2 feet. And so, as with everything in his career, when Edward got this new information, he went whole hog after more and made another massive project out of this. He rode up and down the Connecticut Valley, wherever there was red sandstone present, looking for more tracks. And he found at least a dozen more localities in the very first year and hundreds of additional specimens. And in just less than a year later, he published the first of what would be 20 scientific papers in this field, which he named ichnology, the scientific study of fossilized animal tracks. And that first paper he called ornithechnology, description of the footmarks of birds on new red sandstone in Massachusetts. It was, as I said, he continued this work for another 25 years, collected massive amounts of material, and 2 buildings were constructed at Amherst College at the time to house his collections. The Appleton Cabinet in 1855. There's his tracks shown on display in the Appleton Cabinet. It's now a dormitory. And then very recently, in 2005, if I remember correctly, this magnificent building was constructed, the Baneski Museum of Natural History at Amherst College, where Edward's collections are beautifully exhibited, along with many other skeletons, skulls, rocks, and minerals from Edward's and other Amherst professors' collections. It's eye-opening, and I strongly recommend it. It's been closed for a couple of years because of the pandemic, but I think they're talking about reopening it this fall. So if you've never been there, I bet would love it. Now, the Hitchcock's avian hypothesis, that is, that these tracks were made by birds or bird-like creatures, was a bit controversial. We might say it ruffled a few feathers. For one thing, that they were in red sandstone meant that birds had to have been present at least 100 million years earlier on Earth than any paleontologist was led to believe at that time. So that was controversial. The other controversy was over size, because some of these tracks were extremely large, 18 inches or so. And Edward Hitchcock took a lot of criticism in some quarters and some ridicule. But the truth is that scientists, both in North America and in Europe, pretty soon came on board. And almost universally agreed with Professor Hitchcock that these were in fact animal tracks and that they were probably the tracks of birds or bird-like creatures. Many people at that time, the criticism he got was mostly in the popular press. And in fact, the editor of the Springfield Republican kind of made a hobby out of goading and taunting Hitchcock, oh, this ridiculous idea about these giant birds from long ago. And Edward did not handle that well, I can tell you that. But in any case, even to this day, you hear people say, well, why did Hitchcock insist on his avian hypothesis? But my research tells me that he didn't insist on it. He favored it, true enough. It was the best possible explanation that he could come up with based upon modern animals by comparison. But again and again in his writing and in speeches, he admitted that this wasn't necessarily the only explanation. In 1843, in a speech, he said that there may have been animals in the red sandstone period of a different class, say reptiles, with feet so exactly like our present birds, as shown in these tracks and stones seem to be. It is easy to imagine. And in his opus, Ethnology of New England, published in 1858, just 5 years before his death, or 6 years before his death, he wrote, "I speak of those animals as certainly birds, though doubts sometimes cross one's mind on this point, and I am aware that with some distinguished zoologists, these doubts are strong. But I follow what seems to me at present the most probable view." Why then? Some people asked in his day and even into the 20th century, why didn't he recognize that these were the tracks of dinosaurs? Well, for two pretty good reasons. Number one, because the word dinosaur hadn't even been coined when Edward started his research in 1835. And when it was coined by this man, Sir Richard Owen, in 1841, Owen used it to describe a group of animals represented in the fossil record, like the two you see there, that couldn't possibly have been the track makers, right? They were four-footed. They walked on 4 feet, as you can see. They were plantigrade. They walked on the soles of their feet, and the number of toes was all wrong. So there's no way that Edward Hitchcock would have ever said those tracks are made by Owen's dinosaurs. Well, in the 20th century, our view of dinosaurs changed dramatically. And it became well established that the dinosaurs were the ancestors, some groups of dinosaurs were the ancestors of modern birds. Edward Hitchcock, in other words, was right all along, said Martin Lockley in 1991. The tracks were indeed those of special types of birds. And Robert Baker, one of the most famous dinosaur experts of our time, has written, Hitchcock was the earliest and in many ways the best mind in dinosaur science. All of us 21st century students of the dinosaur-bird relations owe a tip of the hat toward the Reverend Edward Hitchcock. Well, in 1844, the fortunes of Amherst College were in a sad state. There had been a lot of internal tension having to do with anti-slavery, by the way, largely, and other issues as well, among students. There had been a recession, and the college had accrued a lot of debt, and they were very close to closing their doors. And the trustees turned to Edward Hitchcock. They believed, and many others believed, that Edward Hitchcock was the one person that could save Amherst College from dissolution. The trustees believed it, the faculty believed it, the students believed it, the general public believed it, everybody believed it, except Edward Hitchcock. And in his inaugural address, now consider the scene, here he is at the meeting house on the Amherst Common with hundreds of people gathered there, for his inauguration as third president of Amherst College, he said, "But here it is right to confess that my judgment coincides with my feelings in the conclusion that I am unadapted to meet the present exigency." Now that must have gone over real well, right? But then he added, "I yield to the judgment of the trustees and the friends of the college and cheerfully attempt the experiment in reliance upon able coadjutors, upon the liberality of the friends of the college, and above all, upon help from on high." Well, he got a lot of help from on high, but he also got some help of a more earthbound nature when this man, Samuel Williston, the name will be familiar to some of you from Western Massachusetts, the night before Edward's inauguration, he announced to the trustees a gift of $20,000 to the college, the largest single gift ever received by the college. And several other wealthy supporters of the college followed suit soon thereafter. And it wasn't because Edward was such an effective fundraiser. Edward hated asking for money. Now, that's not a good thing for a college president, I wouldn't say. But they gave because they believed in Edward Hitchcock. And very quickly, the fortunes of the college were turned around. In his 1854 retirement address, he wrote, "Oh, what a load did these benefactions take from my mind." Well, to sum up Hitchcock's presidency, in just a few words, enrollment doubled in those 9 years. The debt was retired in just 3 years. There were 4 professorships added. There were 3 new buildings added. And perhaps most importantly of all, harmony was restored within the college. The value of Dr. Hitchcock's presidency to the institution cannot be overestimated, wrote William Tiley. His weight of character and his wise policy saved the institution from dissolution. I can't quite read the end of it there, but something like that. So anyway, the role of Edward Hitchcock in saving Amherst College is well known. Less well known is how important he was to Mount Holyoke, which was founded in 1837 with the support of Edward and Ora. All 4 of their children, their daughters, attended. And Edward was a trustee from 1837 until his death. Less well known than that is that Edward lobbied long and hard for the establishment of a Massachusetts agricultural college. Sadly, it wasn't until 4 years after his death, or 3 years after his death, that Massachusetts Agricultural College was chartered by the state to be located in Amherst. And of course, that is the University of Massachusetts at Amherst today. Edward's greatest ambition in life was to convince his fellow scientists, clergymen, and the general public that science and faith need not be antagonistic, that science should not be regarded as the enemy of religion. He wrote several dozens of scholarly papers on the subject in his life, but in 1851, he published this work, The Religion of Geology and Its Interconnected Sciences, in which he tried to demonstrate the unity of all knowledge and asserted again and again that the hostility between science and revelation is only apparent, not real. When rightly interpreted and understood, they will appear in perfect unison. To put it simply, he believed that God guided the search for scientific truth just as surely as he guided the search for moral and spiritual truth. How did Hitchcock reconcile those conflicts, for example, between Holy Scripture and the findings of modern science? Well, there were 3 ways that I can think of. One is he argued for a thoughtful and informed interpretation of the Bible. For example, the Hebrew word day, as in God created heaven and earth in 6 days, that Hebrew word can mean any length of time, not just 24 hours. So those 6 days could be 6 million years or a billion years or whatever. Furthermore, he asserted that the Bible was not written by scientists or meant to be a scientific document, but rather a book of faith. So when the author of Genesis wrote about Noah's flood covering all of the earth, there was no way that he could know the full extent of that flood. Perhaps it covered just a region such as the Middle East, Hitchcock suggested. And finally, my favorite, Hitchcock argued again and again that the human mind is not capable of understanding everything in God's creation. If you are perplexed about an apparent contradiction between science and your religious beliefs, he advised, wait. One day, all will be explained to you one day in heaven. So there's something to look forward to, right? Of course, the clash between science and religion came to a head in the last few years of Edward Hitchcock's life with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species. At first, Edward argued strenuously against Darwinism on a number of religious points. But if you read his papers carefully in the last few years of his life, you see his thinking about Darwin beginning to pivot. In a very important paper he published in the journal Bibliotheca Sacra in just a year before his death, he wrote, "But after all, the real question is not whether these hypotheses accord with our religious views, but whether they are true." Then he wrote these tantalizing words: "The fact that these new creations are repeated at intervals and seem to form a part of a series of operations which we know to be natural makes it quite probable that they also are natural. Perhaps this unknown law will by and by be discovered, as many new laws have been, to explain phenomena once supposed to be miraculous because anomalous and inexplicable." In other words, he was willing to keep the door open, to keep his mind open on the subject of evolution. Possibly, just possibly, the transmutation of species, natural selection, even human evolution, were all part of God's plan. Now, some historians have labeled Hitchcock as one of the last of the Christian geologists. But if they mean by that term someone who allows religion to intrude upon and influence science, I believe it is not a fair assessment of Edward Hitchcock, for he found his own way of bridging the gap between science and faith. Far from being the last of a dying breed, he might well have been one of the first of a new breed of scientists that were comfortable with a world created by God, but regulated by the laws and principles of nature. There's a story told by one of Hitchcock's students that late in life, when he was starting a new term with one of his geology classes, the class met for the first time in a renovated building with a skylight that brought light into a room that had previously been entirely dark. And on the first day, Professor Hitchcock stood before his students, looking up at the light streaming into the room, smiling, and said the following, which I think is a perfect summary of his fundamental position. "Young gentlemen, all the light we have here comes from above." Okay, well, I will leave it there, except to remind you that I have a webpage, www.edwardhitchcock.com, where you'll find a great deal more information about the man and about my book. I would particularly draw your attention to my blog, Hitchcockiana, which I update periodically. Recently, I added an article about comparing Edward Hitchcock and Louis Agassiz that you might enjoy. I call it The Agassiz and the Ecstasy. There's also a little an account of my explorations in search of Edward Hitchcock's giant boulders. And I think you particularly get a kick out of my meeting with these two bright-eyed young folks, Emily and Sawyer Hitchcock. They are the great, 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 great grandchildren of Edward and Ora. And I think you'll be interested to learn about what their lives are like. There's also a series of shorter Zoomcasts, 15-minute Zoomcasts on a variety of subjects that you might find interesting. And of course, I hope you'll, if you're interested, that you'll read my book. There are many copies available in libraries at this point. Or perhaps you'd like to buy a copy. It's available in paper and in ebook. And you, of course, can get it from the usual online sources, but I always urge my readers to check their local independent bookstore, because if they don't have it on the shelf, they certainly can order it. I think you'll enjoy it. Every chapter begins with a vignette, a fictionalized account with usually with dialogue of an event in the lives of Edward and Ora and their family and friends that I think really brings their personalities and their times to life. Lastly, I'd like to thank a number of organizations that helped me in this process. And particularly, I want to draw attention to Amherst College Archives and Special Collections and the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association in Deerfield, because between them, about 90 or 95% of the primary materials that I used in my research were obtained. Okay, well, that's all I got for you. So I will stop sharing here and
so
entertain
Robert,
questions.
it's nice to talk to another Robert. I don't have the opportunity to do that often. So wonderful job as expected, wonderful presentation, and you hit the right notes at the end, that's for sure. We already have about 5 questions here. So folks, get your questions in. We'll sort of do rapid fire. And we started a few minutes late, so we'll end a few minutes late. Okay. Robert, would you have time for 10 minutes of questions?
Absolutely. And okay. I want to say that I taught at Holyoke Community College for 20 years, and I think I had like 2 Roberts among my thousands of students that whole time. It's right? Just not a name you hear much anymore. So.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of them out there. It's just I've never really had one speak to my library, so it's nice. All right, so we'll go for 10 minutes, folks. Try to hang on with us. Yeah. Mike asks, what was the strangest fossil that Edward found?
Strangest fossil? Oh, that's interesting. He found a shark jaw, which was, not one of the tracks, but the jaw of a shark, which mystified him. And he sent it to Louis Agassiz, who was an expert on such matters. And Agassiz was very interested in it because it was a jaw with 2 rows of teeth instead of 1, if I remember correctly. And that was quite unusual. He also visited a place, and I believe it was in East Windsor, Connecticut, where there were some bones that were said to be reptile bones that had been unearthed, or fossilized reptile bones. And he was horrified when he discovered what he believed to be human bones, and which he thought was a sacrilege for them to be dug up. And so that was shocking to him.
All right, so that question was from Mike. Marianne asks, how did aura influence Edward in his accomplishments? Were they compatible in their academic endeavors?
Yes, and I go into this a great deal in the book. Aura was absolutely essential to him. Certainly, she was an artist who illustrated, did literally thousands of illustrations for his books and posters for his classroom. She raised his children. She managed this household that not only had a bundle of children, they had 7 children in their married life, but also became the social center of Amherst College. And she did it all with ease. She had this way about her where she just floated over the cares and woes of life, unlike Edward, who could be rather mercurial. So she helped to calm him, to assuage his fears and his worries. And I say in the book that without aura, he probably would never have accomplished half of what he did, and he probably wouldn't have lived half as long as he did.
Diane has 2 questions. First, she asks, how was Hitchcock able to accurately assess the geology if the state was so wooded?
If what?
Well, I think she might have missed a word or 2, but I think she's asking, how was Hitchcock able to accurately assess the geology if the state with so much of it being wooded? So a lot of woods in the state. How was he able to accurately assess the geology?
Well, in Hitchcock's time, it wasn't a heavily forested state. It was actually quite barren. If we could walk about to there back then, we'd be shocked, I think, at how little forest there was, because the forest had been removed and much of it was in sheep pasture. But he and also, there weren't railroads and roads that had cut into the bedrock. So it was a challenge, but there was plenty of outcrops, and he used his hammer to chip away rocks and minerals, brought specimens back, and made very, very long lists of them, and was very thorough. I mean, some towns, there were 20 or 30 specimens collected in a single town.
An anonymous attendee asks, how did you find out about all of his travels as a preacher? Did he keep a record of these travels?
Yes, and Amherst College has nearly all his sermons. Deerfield has a few, the original sermons. And on the cover page, he would record the place and the date of each delivery of that particular sermon. And so I compiled them all into a database and was able to count up how many times he preached in Conway or in Deerfield or in Newton. He preached a number of times in Newton, and so on. So I got it from his sermons, from his actual sermons. About 250 of his sermons have survived. We have no idea how many have not survived either. So he may have preached a lot more than we know about.
Eva Jane asks, respectfully, will you comment on how or if your research for the book has impacted your own religious beliefs?
I have a great deal of admiration for Edward's faith and for his unwillingness to let his scientific endeavors be shaped or molded by his faith. I wouldn't say that I have anything like Edward's faith, but I have a great deal of admiration for somebody like him that puts his faith into action. And by the way, Louis Agassiz is almost the counter, the opposite of Edward Hitchcock. He claimed to be a Christian, but he was not a very good man. Edward Hitchcock lived his faith.
Polly asks, when did Hitchcock learn about dinosaurs, their size, their footprints, the connection with the prints he found?
Yep. Well, the modern understanding of the word dinosaur didn't become current among paleontologists until probably 1860, the last few years of Edward's life. And he did wrestle with and even then it was fragmentary, but a couple of large dinosaur skeletons were unearthed in New Jersey in 1858, and they started to reveal the diversity of dinosaurs, and probably should have hinted to Edward that, my track makers were somewhat like these fellows. I don't think he ever made that transition, but he was very close to the end of his life at that time.
Looks like the final question is going to Michelle, and you may have touched on this a little bit, but she asks, is there any lingering works regarding his bridge between science and faith still at Amherst College and or UMass?
Any continuing work?
Yeah, she uses the word lingering works, specifically about bridging between science and faith.
Yes. If there is, I'm not aware of it. There's certainly plenty of work going on elsewhere around the country and around the world on the relation between science and faith. And of course, it's very, very controversial. You read Edward's writings, and it's like they are just as applicable today as they were 200 years ago. People are still wrestling with this idea of science skepticism and so on. I'm not aware of any current research in that area at Amherst College or at UMass, but there certainly is elsewhere. And there's some references to it on my webpage.
Let's see. Deb says, thank you. Diana says, thank you very much. Michelle says, this was great. Thank you. Gregory says, very interesting and informative talk. Thank you, Mr. McMaster, and all those who put this together. So, Robert, wait a second. Let me check the Q&A. It looks like we might have gotten something here. Robert, you missed my second question. Oh, my goodness. Okay. So last question goes to Diane. And again, I think Diane likes to miss a word. So she likes to miss a word and then make me try to figure out what she's trying to say. But Diane says, are there any dinosaur tracks left in blank, or did Hitchcock collect them all?
Well, Hitchcock collected many, yes, but there are still some places where you can see them in the Connecticut Valley. There's a site belonging to the Trustees of Reservations in Holyoke. There's a site in Granby, South Hadley, that is just come into the state's ownership, the Nash property, and maybe eventually will be open to the public. And there's a fantastic state park in Connecticut called Dinosaur State Park, which probably is the best place to see dinosaur tracks still in situ, in their natural setting. But the places in Massachusetts are few and far between.
We had a request to put the links in the chat, so I will attempt to do that as we wrap up here.
Yep.
All right, there's edwardhitchcock.com.
Thanks.
You did a good job of securing that URL, Robert.
Yep.
So Francis says, thank you to both Roberts. Polly says this was excellent, fascinating. Eva says this was an absolutely riveting talk from a wonderful speaker. Looking forward to reading his book. So Robert, do you have any last words before we wrap it up for the evening?
Not at all, except to, again, thank you and the cooperating libraries and everybody who's tuned in. And I hope that if you're interested, you'll read the book and find out more about this amazing fellow.
All right, well, thank you so much, Mr. McMaster. Folks, look for that email tomorrow, link to a feedback survey, link to a recording, and information about some other upcoming virtual author visits. Thank you very much, Mr. McMaster, and I hope you and everyone else enjoys the rest of their evening. Thanks again.
Yep, so long.
Bye-bye.